I now see that we are at the top of the hour, so let me go ahead and begin. This is the third of four main presentations that Reg and I are doing. I am on my own this time because, as Reg says, he's in Vienna, Austria. He's in his dreams right now, or I'm in his dreams right now. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, but I would also ask a little assistance. In earlier presentations, I've had a little bit of either a local bandwidth problem in our neighborhood, or I've had some Zoom problems. So if things happen to lock up at all, the best thing to probably do is break in with unmuting yourself and let me know what the problem is and where the slides are. We've had that problem. The audio didn't seem to be impacted at all. Hopefully that won't happen. Again, I'm Ross Worth, and this is part of a joint effort that I've been doing with Reg Butterfield, and is really the result of a 3-year collaboration where we started investigating originally why so many organizational change initiatives fail. And that got into an examination of the change models we use, an examination of new change models relative to continuous, routine, adaptive change. And that brought us eventually to looking at organizational design and how the organization itself and the structure and operating aspects actually hinders, in many cases, the change process. And in many instances, it's wise to actually take a look at how the organization operates to figure out how best to make it more conducive to change. Going forward, then, let's take a brief look at the earlier presentations. We're now moving into the structural and operating principles of what we've been working on. We started off yesterday with the challenges that face the traditional approaches. And this led into really challenging our assumptions about why we think about organizational change and organizations in general, and how those assumptions in many ways are hindering our ability to really be more efficient or effective in our change process. This morning, then, we jumped from that point and looked into designing organizations that are built for change. And we did that through examining a number of non-traditional organizations that are either using a network structure, or they're using a network structure that is really behind and attached to the traditional hierarchy. From that, we generalized and looked at what are the key principles of how to better organize for change. And that's really our jumping off point for this presentation, where we're now going to look at the essential design principles. Tomorrow, then, in the fourth presentation, Reg will go a little bit deeper into how we're actually looking at implementing these design principles for, again, an adaptive routine change process. Looking forward, then, there's different levels of focus when you look at an organization. The tip of the iceberg might be considered the structural and operating principles. These are the key things that we will be using to really guide a distributed leadership model. We're moving away from a command and control hierarchy, but when you do that, something needs to be done to give some guidance to the organization that is currently embedded within the command structure. Part of this will be evidence in practice. Again, these are the things that you see, but more important are the simple rules that drive behavior. These are the things that people do within the informal organization, and they might be called the DNA or embedded in the culture of the organization. Oftentimes we try to change this, but we try to change it almost with brute force without thinking about why things happen as they do. And oftentimes what you end up with are the quote, simple rules. And this really comes from complexity science, how the organization or the behavior within the organization evolves, changes, and reacts based upon the simple interpersonal rules that govern our decision-making process. Going forward, though, we really need to take a look at the traditional hierarchy itself. This is where we ended up when we started asking, why do so many change initiatives fail? And the question often comes as, what is that failure rate? Going back 20 years ago when I was working on my doctorate degree, I actually quoted the 30% failure, or I should say the 30% success rate, 70% failure rate within my dissertation. And one committee chair that was outside of management actually questioned that statistic and demanded that I document it. Actually, it was pretty easy to document in the academic literature where others were quoting it, but it's very, very difficult to actually find good studies to back it up. The challenge is, what is the change objective? When is the change objective really set, because it evolves over time during the change process? And more importantly, who gets to decide success or failure? So what I can really come back to is the McKinsey survey of CEOs that they do annually. And this has been pretty consistent for many years, that when they ask the CEOs how satisfied, again, it's a satisfaction indicator, how satisfied they are with their organizational change initiatives, it pretty much comes close to 30%, maybe plus or minus 2 or 3. So that success rate from a satisfaction perspective does seem to support the 30%. But again, if so many people will willingly quote that 30% success, that also indicates some beliefs that it is relatively correct. The question comes is, why that level, and why are people accepting that level? And it really comes down to, when you get to the heart of it, I think that organizations are designed for 3 primary functions. First off, they're designed to produce work. Work is the outcome, and work can be many different things, and is mission or purpose-driven type of work. It's the real purpose of why that organization, and this is regardless of whether it's a for-profit, a government entity, or a nonprofit organization, is designed to do something. Secondly, organizations are designed for some type of managerial control of that activity. And thirdly, they're designed to lead change, or they need to be designed to lead change to respond to an evolving environment. So you've got 3 different really design purposes for organization: get the work produced, manage or control, and lead and change, evolve over time as necessary. The real challenge, though, comes is that when you look at traditional hierarchy, it's trying to do all 3 of these functions within a structure that is designed for control. Okay, and that's really where we came to a real realization that that is a key problem, and that when you design for control, implicitly, you're designing out the opportunity for easy change. Admittedly, the structure requires some periodic modification, but because it's not designed for easy change, that comes across as a disjointed or a disruption to that stability. And that's the heart of our problem. But it also brings to a question that too often we do not ask ourselves. What if? What if we designed the organization for change and not for control? And that's kind of an interesting question that we rarely ask. But when you ask it, you start to think about, what is control? How is it done? And how can it be done? And it really opens up the bigger challenge of what are our assumptions that we routinely do without question. It also brings up the broader question of control relative to controlling the present and controlling the future. This gets into the issue of you manage or control the present, but you lead change for the future. And too often we try to do that within the same structure, but what ends up happening is that the present firefighting takes up so much time that rarely do we get around to thinking about changing for the future until that future necessity becomes a crisis in the present and we're forced into a reaction for the change. This then gets to the heart then of how do you split the present control from the future control. This also opens up the issue of control that is distributed across the organization versus control that is delegated. As we talked about in the earlier presentation this morning, the traditional hierarchy focuses on delegating control down into the organization, where some of the networks and alternate structures that have a network built behind the traditional hierarchy, some of that control is distributed outside of the traditional hierarchy itself. So we have seen that it is possible. The challenge then is how do you design to make that happen easily? This gets to where we were this morning. What can we learn from the non-traditional structures? We've seen what works, but in all cases we examined, none of them were without at least some problems. We looked at sociocracy, Cotter's dual operating system, Nucor, Gore, and Hire. All had great benefits in the way they organize themselves, but none were perfect. But collectively, when you look at all of them, you can see the nuggets and put together all the pieces that make something better than each one individually. We also get into then what is control for the present versus the future. And that gets into different orders of control. For example, think about a thermostat, which is a first order control. You're controlling the temperature, say at 72 degrees. Based upon the room temperature, the furnace or air conditioner turns on and off. That is controlling the present. Second and third order control is not being done at that level. Second order control is you deciding what the thermostat setting should be. That becomes a planning function that requires a separate thought and separate process. Or should we even control the thermostat? Or should we control the heat and air conditioning by opening and closing windows? Or should we use a gas or electric furnace or a geothermal heat pump? There's a number of issues that are very, very different than when you take a look at future control, which gets into the second and third order types of control. Going back then as what did we learn from these non-traditional structures that can be generalized into a new design process? First was that autonomy is possible. All of these organizations with networks are very successful in distributing decision-making across the organization, but it comes with the necessity of alignment. And the alignment comes through the control process of a traditional hierarchy naturally, and that's one of the reasons why the hierarchy is so control-oriented. It's trying to do an alignment process without parts of the organization flying off in different directions. So when you distribute decision-making, you also have to put some tension against that going too out of whack, and that comes through alignment. So there is a challenge then of autonomy and purpose, and that requires the alignment across the organization. The network structures do work successfully, we've seen that, but they also require some support. That support comes either through an alignment process or in many cases, a learning curve, such as sociocracy, that has a very high learning curve in the way they facilitate and document meetings and how they make decisions around the decision criteria or decision rights within certain parts of the organization. But it is possible, and we've seen that there are examples of how to do that. We've also seen in these examples that accountability is possible and comes naturally when you work with small units. Small units that are directly connected have the accountability built into those connections, and you're no longer pushing problems up the organization and then possibly across and down into correlated silos. So by having the direct connections, you're eliminating much of the conflict within silos and building accountability at the same time. You're also building more direct communication without filtering. Filtering not only going up the organization, but filtering going down the organization of what is communicated and how that communication is spun relative to the politics within the organization. We've also seen what we're calling an entrepreneurial spirit is possible. This is how to be more flexible, more responsive, more agile, any number of terms that you can use relative to keeping the organization moving rapidly without getting caught up in the bureaucracy that comes when the decision-making is delegated and not distributed. Okay. Going forward then, how can this be done? This is where we now need to start turning into the design elements. We've looked at this from the principles of structure and principles of operations. We now need to flip around to how do you design an organization to do that. And again, we're talking about an organization that is designed to be proactive and handle change routinely and adaptively. Okay, the design elements then. Part of the challenge in here is to split the organization design. As I mentioned earlier, the traditional hierarchy is trying to do multiple things within the same structure. The challenge then is how do you organize around work instead of organizing around control? Now, even within a distributed or a networked organization, there is some stability at a snapshot in time. The key is how easy is it to modify that? And that is part of designing change into the organization itself. Going further then is the control processes and the change processes need to be formalized as a separate focus. The second and third order of control and change is actually a separate and recognized focus of the organization and not an afterthought. Too often this comes as an afterthought when problems become a crisis, long after the symptoms of the core problem have been recognized by people throughout the organization, or it comes through an annual process, maybe through strategy consideration. Again, it is oftentimes pushed into the same organization and not dealt with until it has to be dealt with, or as a routine annual process, which oftentimes is basically a rubber stamp of what happened the year before and not a true thought process of what the organization changes are needed. So if we were to take a look then around organizing around control, let's take a look at how traditional organizations evolve over time and what happens with the control function. Looking at a startup organization, a general small startup is built around a single person or a small team. This is what would be called a traditional hub and spoke type of model, where there is a control, the control is centralized and then delegated throughout the rest of the organization. But again, that control is very manageable because the organization is small and the number of issues coming forward to that point is rather controllable itself. Going forward though, with that growth, that center then becomes the top of a traditional hierarchy or a pyramid structure, and the direct reports then start adding more complexity. The challenge then is when that shift in structure occurs, what happens to the control? Traditionally, what happens is what had been control point that's embedded in the hub now becomes delegated control throughout the organization. That is what traditionally happens because the whole thought process is around controlling the operation. The person or the team that had been in a central point naturally continues with that same, but they can't handle everything, so they start delegating. But what they're delegating is not decision rights as much as they're delegating control of those decision rights. Going back as a different point of view, though, let's talk about effectuation versus causation. Effectuation comes from the theory of effectuation, which is the study of successful entrepreneurship. It's how entrepreneurs are able to move forward with limited means. Within a more traditional management structure, it's causation. You move forward with necessity of control. Within this, then, we've taken a look at entrepreneurs are taking action with what they have. They are basically looking at the means and then evaluating what goals are possible from those means. That's very different from a causation thought process that looks at the goals, identifies the gap, and then the resources, and proceeds to acquire those necessary resources. The difference then is that entrepreneurs move quickly because they're taking action as they can. They're controlling their future with what they have available to them, where other organizations get slowed down because they're having to look at what resources that they need to go forward to meet their needs. Risk is also very different here in that a growing, larger organization has risk management as a key function with an expectation of a return. Entrepreneurs are much more risk-taking, but they manage that risk very differently. They look at the risk as an affordable loss. And we saw this with the Gore structure earlier, in that you could take risks, particularly if you're learning new technology, new opportunities, but you only take those risks to the extent that you can afford the loss if it doesn't work. The key then is how to reduce that risk, which is often done through partnerships. Instead of building all resources themselves, smaller organizations partner and they build in additional means to go forward through those partnerships. This is the way Hire really operates. They offload much of their risk through their partners, but they build into those contractual relationships a way that if it's successful, they can then buy into more of that partner operation. So effectively, they're able to offload some risk, but then buy back. But they're not going to get the full return themselves, but they reduce the risk greatly to the entity and are able to move quicker because they don't have to acquire those resources themselves. There's also a difference of how you look at surprises. Entrepreneurs are constantly testing things, trying, quickly eliminating what doesn't work, building on what does work. These are surprises that organizations larger with a traditional hierarchy really don't like. Nobody likes to surprise or see surprises or have to bring surprises forward into the organization because the reward structure is not designed to reward failure. It's rewarding success, but you can't often get success without having some failure along the way. So the traditional hierarchy almost builds in a risk avoidance process where effectuation builds in a risk acceptance if the loss is affordable. Looking then about organizing around work. Before we were talking about organizing around control, now let's talk about how some of these organizations organize around work. A typical network structure, and this would be typical of a Hire network structure, where they've got multiple micro enterprises, small teams or small entities working as if they were separate organizations. In this particular example here, you've got a value chain of manufacturing 1 doing components to feed manufacturing 2 that then feeds sales to eventual distribution to the customers. So what could be considered one particular organization within Hire is actually split into 3 separate operations with relationships between those 3. At the same time, staff functions such as IT and HR will serve as micro enterprises to those organizations. Within the Hire group, those are contractual relationships, and any micro enterprise can choose to use an internal source or they can go outside. So if manufacturing 1 group is not getting the support that they think they need from IT, they can go and hire an outside IT organization, or they can maybe merge some of their thought process between manufacturing 1, manufacturing 2, and charter a new internal IT organization that will compete with the original IT organization. And this happens regularly, in which case an internal micro enterprise can be put out of business if they do not support their internal customers. But at the same time, an internal micro enterprise has an advantage of the outside because they have the relationships and they have an understanding of contracting between the different enterprises. This is similar to actually a organization I worked with early in my career. It was an internal management consulting where we did technical computer programming. Think back 40 years, much of what we do in Excel nowadays was actually programmed in Fortran. I was in the group that did that. But we did not have a corporate fund. We had to put together a budget each year by getting commitments from operating groups. And 10% of my time was actually spent wandering around the organization looking for problems that we can help them solve. And that was basically the same type of thing that Hire does here with the internal organization. For them to be successful as an internal staff function, they had to provide value to other parts of the organization. And this is done through networking of small units that are customer facing, and everything is customer facing here because the internal customers are just as important as facing to the outside external customer. And to the extent that sales sees something needed from the external customer, that then ripples through the direct connections to necessary parts, whether it be manufacturing 2 or an R&D or HR or IT to support that customer need. So immediately those customer needs can be then linked and diffused throughout the organization as necessary on a rapid basis without having to go into the organization silos up across and get necessary approval and budget to do things. Things happen much quicker because you got direct connection, direct accountability. Going forward then, this is actually distributed decision-making that is at the customer interface. And this is a key component. We often talk about organizations need to be customer focused, but too often it's only part of the organization that is customer focused because they're the only ones that are dealing with it. There's not the interaction or the quick diffusion of communication across the organization that you find within a network structure. Let's take a look then a little bit more detail to the decision-making process itself. Within a causation, there is tight control over that decision-making and the decision-making rights. Within a distributed decision-making process, that becomes much more of effectuation, much more entrepreneurial, and those decisions can be addressed quicker through the relationships that they have and the ability they're able to pull resources together. It also gets into the goal process itself of the extent that goals have to be approved versus doing what you can doing what you can with what you have available to you. Again, this gets into the flip process of the relationship between resources and goals, or what you can do with what you have versus what you need to get to the goal. So it's a different thought process. This is not to say that once an entrepreneurial organization becomes more traditional with a hierarchy and control function, some effectuation still contains in some decision, but for the most part is pushed out because it's very difficult to do effectuation in a controlled environment. Looking more then at the control and change functions, the things that happen below the waterline routinely. This is the change process and the levers that we have for that change process. We're now talking about effectuation thinking and how purpose can be aligned across the organization. We then talk about the change in control, again, how to separate first order control from, how to separate first order control from second and third order control, such that we don't overlook the higher orders of control. We also then get into the point of what are the design elements necessary to put this type of organization together, and what does that mean for change and how organizations operate. Drilling down then, let's take a look a little bit more detail at effectuation, or the entrepreneurial spirit, and how to retain that through the organization as it continues to grow beyond a simple hub and spoke process. And this is only possible if you free the organization from delegated control. Part then is how to allow the organization to take control with available means and move toward what is possible, and keep it from getting bogged down into a bureaucratic approval process. To do this requires an ability to partner with others, even if they're imperfect. It's how to build up a relationship of partnerships internal to the organization as well as external possible partners. And this requires also building up some strategic opportunities. You're able to look at who knows what within the organization and who knows what outside the organization before it may be necessary. So that you're not looking for resources, you're building up a knowledge base that you can draw upon as needed, such that the organization then is a network. Some parts of that network are operational at any given time. Other parts may be called upon when needed. Also requires the scaling of success and quickly adjusting or killing decisions as necessary. This is the experimentation process that can only be done if we allow risks to be taken if they're affordable. The key is you take the risk, you learn from it, you build upon success. If it is not successful, you learn from it, modify it, change, and keep moving. The key, though, is that that is a natural process and is built into the entrepreneurial spirit of effectuation itself. We also need to talk in more detail about purpose alignment. And this is a critical component because as you distribute decision-making across a network, that can easily get out of hand by individual parts of the organization might be saying do their own thing, or in relationship to within their small network connections. This requires some type of tension to be developed so that there is some tension through the alignment of the decision-making process and the purpose of the organization. By doing this, though, by focusing on purpose alignment, we're actually able to do something a little bit different that too often does not happen. Oftentimes, when you do a autopsy of a corporate failure, you will find that they put off till tomorrow what they should have done yesterday. The problems that are small are ignored because they're fighting other current problems. It becomes a short-term versus long-term. We talk about having to do the long-term thinking, but we're trying to do that long-term thinking within a structure and a command and control with the goals that oftentimes are short-term focused. This gets into the challenge then of how to split the long-term thinking from the short-term thinking, because you can't do just long-term thinking, you have to keep the short-term going. This gets into then how to do purpose alignment and have that internal tension. It also requires not a management of a portfolio of change, but a facilitation of a portfolio of change. A lot of times we think that when we add more and more change initiatives, which are discrete by themselves, we start looking at the conflicts and we start having to manage that. The key, though, is how to handle those conflicts within portfolio of change, of making it as a routine process without having to come in and control that portfolio and decide what's changed, what doesn't change. This again gets back to a core part of purpose alignment. Purpose alignment also has to address boundary management. If you have a dynamically organizing network of organizational entities, boundaries aren't always static. They need to change as the needs are evolving relative to the business environment external, or as new opportunities are identified for internal improvement. Any number of things can cause the boundaries to have some conflict with a need for modification. The key then also is how to do that purposefully rather than reactionary. It also requires some network weaving. And this is where some of the current organizations do this as an ad hoc basis. So for example, Hire, they do this as a issue comes up, they form new teams. To some extent, this is done within Kotter's dual structure also, in which case when problems arrive, they then form new teams, they form new relationships. But again, these types of network weaving are often done reactively. The question comes is, why do they have to be done reactively? Could you then be looking at how things are evolving, look at the trends, look at the opportunities, and purposely do what network weaving? This is an opportunity itself. So collectively, what we see here in alignment, facilitating a portfolio of change, managing the boundaries and how to purposely network and connect parts of the organization, we see parts of that already being done within Hire's use of platforms for their network weaving and alignment. We also see it kind of in the way of Kotter's operating system that's in the shadow of the traditional hierarchy. So there are parts of this available. The key then is how to put it together purposefully for alignment so that you can do a distributed decision-making process. Looking forward then, for organizing principles, what kind of summary do we have? Going back then for structural principles, we've seen that it is possible and very efficient in many ways to have a network of small operating units, all of which are customer facing, internal facing as well as external facing. And it is possible to do alignment across the organization. Some are doing it informally, but it is also possible to formalize that alignment. It is also possible to organize around operating principles, how to distribute decision-making at these customer interfaces across the network, how to have direct and open communication such that the communication is not being filtered by the sender, it's being filtered by the receiver, and how to maintain an entrepreneurial spirit across the organization as the organization builds. These key things then are really designed around the structural principles and the operating principles that then takes us into how to design an organization that is an adaptive network, that is purpose aligned and effectual driven. These are three critical components that need to be designed for so that these principles are actually put into place. Once in place, the organization then is designed to be change driven, or change, I should say, it's designed to be built for change, because it's no longer an afterthought. It is no longer being fought by the control functions that's embedded in the organization itself. So what does this design look like? Okay. First off, it's a network structure that has distributed decision-making, and it is effectual driven, where effectuation is driven over causation. But a critical component is what Reg and I are coming up with as a purpose alignment team. This is a critical part that really holds things together in a formalized way. It creates the tension that is needed to enable the three earlier things to effectively operate. It also does the proactive work that is often only addressed reactively when there is a problem itself. These design components then are what's really the ability to drive the structure and the operations that support the principles that we see or we desire. The four simple design elements then become really an end state of a new way of thinking about organizations, a way of thinking about organizations that are designed for change and not designed for control. And tomorrow, Reg will be picking up here of how to put this into implementation. And as part of that, how to move as a transition through individual design elements and how we can basically morph an organization to get to this type of structure. The key then is going forward with a new way of thinking about organizations. Let me go ahead and open up to questions now. Let me close this and stop the share. I've got a number of questions that came in on the chat, but since I am not working with Reg, if individually, if you've got a question, please unmute yourself and ask that question. And if there's any lull in the questions coming from you, I will be scanning through the chat to see what I've missed during the presentation.
So I have a couple. Hi.
Go ahead.
So one is just a curiosity about whether or not we need a new word in the future that takes change to be something that's more cyclical or adaptive. You know, so that's just sort of like a hypothesis to sort of just think about, right? And this
that's a great question, and it's one that we've struggled with. And it's one that has come up already a couple of times in the last year on the Change Management Network. I've also seen it come up probably once or twice a year on different LinkedIn organizational change groups. And it is a valid question. And there's conflicting opinions here. So for example, this group is called the Change Management Network. I hate the use of change management, but when you take a look at search terms, change management dwarfs everything else. So for marketing purposes, I'm stuck with it. Okay, but at the same time, when I've taught courses at the college level, oftentimes I've actually changed the name. What had been called change management, I've changed to organizational change. And when I look at organizational change, it's a higher level, but within organizational change, I see three components. I see change management, which is managing the change process. I see change leadership, which is leading the change vision. But I also add a third, and I think equally important component, and that is change enablement. Because involvement of people is so important, how do you enable their involvement? And to a large extent, what Reg and I are doing is really leaning toward the change enablement. And it gets back to some other questions that came up earlier this morning, that people resist change. And actually, that's not really true. They resist being changed. If you give them the control over the change process, what's changed and how to do that change, they really don't resist it. They really welcome it because they want change within their area. They just want to be able to control it. And part of what we're talking about in this distributed decision-making really gives them that control. But what the right name should be, I don't know. Another part of your question comes up in a related topic is what happens to change practitioners when change becomes everybody's job? And that's a valid point. I mean, there's going to be an obvious need to do these transitions, but there's also going to be, I think, a shift back to organization development as it originally came out. Okay, organization development to a large extent has been pushed to the side by change management, or it's been relegated to the HR department, and the rest of the organization focuses on the management of change. And I think OD has a really critical component going forward on helping the organization make sense of itself and become effective. So therefore, the function remains, but its focus changes at the same time. But what we call everything, I don't know. Reg and I are calling it something because we need to name what we're doing. But at the same time, we're stuck with change management to some extent until a better name comes along. But excellent to know.
I'm cheering on your OD piece, and I completely agree. Can I just ask one practical question?
Go
Maybe
ahead.
at the end of this, if you could go back to slide 12, because effectuation was a new term for me, and I think I missed the third bullet. So just at the end. Thank you.
Okay, remind me on that. I can do it. And because effectuation, this is really heavy resources. I think at the University of Virginia, they've been doing a lot of work there on effectuation, but it hasn't really changed all that much. And with a lot of things that Reg and I are doing, we're finding not necessarily something that's totally new. What we're finding is a bunch of things that individually have been out there for a while. They just haven't been brought together. So effectuation and the interface of that with change and organization post-entrepreneurial startup really hasn't been addressed. But when you think about it and you think about what's keeping effectuation from happening, then you start seeing things differently. And that, I think, is what Reg and I are coming around to. Isn't necessarily new, because we're obviously not new to effectuation. We're seeing a new application for it. Okay.
I have one quick comment. This is
Go ahead.
Like Seymour said. Back to the terms we use, like management, control, the language that has this negative notions, right? I think this was mentioned in another session yesterday. You mentioned about the resistance, right?
Yes.
Another word might be readiness. I mean, people are just not ready. I mean, they may not have the resistance. Maybe if we start using these type of words that don't provide that negative notion, maybe that's one way to kind of move forward with this whole change. Because change itself, for most people, have that negative notion. Maybe us utilizing these replacement words might help.
Yep. No, I agree, and I've done a number of lectures and actually a whole course. And when I started doing a course on managing change resistance, I got into all of the traditional things on what causes change, all the different ways change resistance is demonstrated. But when you get down to it, oftentimes that resistance comes from a couple things. One is resistance to the objective, not necessarily the change, but the objective, because the people creating that objective don't know everything they should know, or they might be opposed to some of the process and the interrelationship with other changes underway and the time constraints. And when you get down to it, change resistance oftentimes is not described or defined by the person resisting. Change resistance is defined by the change leadership team. And too often that change leadership team uses resistance as an excuse for their failures. They failed to involve people early on. So for example, there's 5 levels of involvement. Many people would like to use level 1. They would like to tell people what to do, what to change. They realize level 1 will not work, so they go to level 2, selling. And most of what you see in change management textbooks is all built around selling change. But you've left off the table 3 additional higher levels of involvement. You've left off testing, you left off consulting, and you left off co-creation. And much of what happens when you distribute decision-making is you talk about change from co-creation. And people are much more likely to accept change that they are involved in defining and implementing, and are no longer being controlled themselves. So it comes back again to, I think, control. And in many cases, we need to rethink our role in resistance itself. But again, that's one of the assumptions, that too often we expect change, we look for it, and we find it, versus thinking about what's causing it. And oftentimes we need to point at ourselves as the number one cause, or the people who initiate the change, which also gets back to our role as change specialist. Too often we're brought in after the change objective is established. Too often resistance is already in place and we're there to clean up the mess. In reality, too often the change objective is established not through diagnosis of the core problem. The objective is established as the first feasibly, politically correct opportunity that they have, or fits their personal agenda. This is, to a large extent, I think it's why we see resistance. It's not because the resistance is really there. It's the process taken that leads to resistance. But again, assumptions too often aren't addressed head on.
This is Pam. I have a quick question.
Okay. Go ahead.
Annette made a very good point about, changing names, and you had a great response with organizational change. But I have found myself over the years having to explain, and re-explain, because I go into some organizations and, when I say change management, they say management of change. And I have to find myself explaining the difference between change management and management of change, because they use management of change in their IT functions, which is different from change management. And it just takes so much to get them to understand the difference.
Yeah,
have you that, and how do you approach it?
That's a critical component, because oftentimes IT and governance issues talks about managing as, and really the issue there is, are you managing change from those perspectives, or are you documenting the change process and making sure that the people who are involved? And oftentimes IT change is a documentation problem and a connection problem, and not really organizational change per se. And that might be an opportunity where you can change the dialogue of what is organizational change, is what is documentation as necessary for the process, particularly when you get into governance or regulatory issues. It also gets down into moving away from management in your terminology. And let's talk about change leadership and change enablement along with change management, because all 3 are needed. And if you focus just on one, you're missing out on the total picture that needs to be done.
Okay. So when you did talk about change enablement, what did you said change leadership was leading the change vision, and you said change enablement was what? Okay. How did you term it?
Let me give you all 3 again. Change management is managing the change process. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you put together a change initiative, you can manage the process itself. but you have to lead the change vision. And this is where Cotter really came from. Cotter, in his leading change, he really focused not on the management of change. He focused on the leading with vision as a key component. But you can manage the change process and you could lead the change vision. But there's a third, and I think equally important, and that is the people side of change. And the people side of change is the involvement of people.
Mhm.
Oftentimes we involve people after the fact or when they are resisting because we failed to involve them early on. So the key thing is think about the vision, think about the process, but also equally think about how we involve people throughout the process and throughout the crafting of the change objective itself. So I put equal component on all three because without any one of them, you're going to run into problems. And
Okay.
to some extent, what Reg and I are doing is probably placing a little bit more emphasis on the change enablement of how do we remove the control and release people to be involved in the change process itself.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Good question, though. And again, these types of questions really challenges what we think about when we talk about organizational change, because too often we jump over these types of hidden assumptions. We go forward with a vocabulary that we're used to using without realizing that that vocabulary sometimes may be constraining or maybe limiting how we communicate the broader picture of where we want to go to others.
Would you recommend since a lot of times, and you said it correctly, we don't get engaged into a lot of these change activities until, the project is already kicked off and they have the so-called vision and, all of these things in place. Do you think that there's an opportunity somewhere in here where we can start the education process to do exactly what you said? Let's talk about what's the difference between, or the layers of change management, change leadership, and change enablement.
Yeah, I think it is necessity that we do that, because to the extent that they're bringing you or us collectively in to clean up a mess, it's an opportunity to let's step back and maybe do not necessarily an after action review, but let's do a mid action review. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about how we got to where we are, because if you analyze how you got to where you are, you can also then identify where mistakes were made earlier, because when you clean up the mess, it's really having to go back. When you come into a messy situation, you can't just go forward. Generally, you have to step back and correct something that was done earlier. And this is where one of the key learning that you might try to get across to others is that oftentimes you have to go slow early to go quicker later. Because by skipping over things early on, you end up spending more time fixing mistakes and doing what you should have done early, but you have to do it midstream. And I think this is part of the process that we have to educate the organization, because to the extent we don't educate the organization, they're going to continue the same process. This also gets into a challenge that I've thought about a lot as an educator. Okay, I came in to academia with 32 years of internal consulting and strategic and operational planning. When I went into academia, I came in as the undergraduate business administration program chair and later moved up to the dean of the College of Business. And when you look at where does organizational change and organization development fit within the curriculum, it doesn't fit very well. We're expecting people across the organization to have some change competency now. But when you look at the curriculum itself, management, leadership, business development, they may have one organizational change course that is an elective, and that elective requires a prerequisite of organization behavior, which is also an elective. So when you take a look at the graduates in those degrees, the number of people that takes first an organizational behavior elective, followed by an organizational change elective, you're talking about probably 10 to 25% of the graduates that actually have any formal training at all in one course. Same with organization development. It's generally an elective in the HR program, which also requires organization behavior. The advantage there is that org behavior is generally a required course, so you're one step removed there, but still an elective. When you talk about accountants, marketers, supply chain management, project management, a lot of these degree programs, it is an elective, and oftentimes not even a degree elective, but a university elective. So when you take a look at organizational change, organization development as a core training component in college degrees, it's pretty small. And even at that, within one semester, for the most part, all you can get across is an awareness. You don't get a lot of real competency. Within the MBA program, it's even worse, because the MBA program is really an accelerated program of all business disciplines. Oftentimes, organization change is limited to maybe 1 to 3 lectures in one course on management or leadership, and that's it. You're getting a real superficial view of organizational change, but that is the training ground that most business managers have today. They're either learning it from consultants if they can afford a consultant, or they learn about organizational change observationally. They learn what others have done, but if others have done poor change process, that's what they're learning, which repeats the process of poor change results. So that's the opportunity of a major change competency initiative that we really need. Part of the challenge that Reg and I are trying to do is how to build some of that competency into the structure of the operating principles and the structure principles itself, such that the learning curve for change competency becomes a little bit more natural because it's built in versus having to learn it separate from daily operations. But excellent observation.
Thank you for the response.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Other question.
Yeah, I've got a question, Dr. Worth. Really, first of all, I want to say I really enjoyed the session. Sort of speaks to me. But I'm curious. I'm much more sort of on the experiment side than on the theory side. And I'm curious if, although your theory is new, and so you won't have a client that actually went through your process and has implemented, but if you look at companies that currently exist, is there one other than Haier, which is because it's a Chinese company and it's a little more difficult to get information about them, and you pointed this out earlier, other than Haier, that exemplifies an implementation that you would say, yeah, they're doing it the way I would do it?
Not holistically. I think the closest as we're getting to some of the white papers that I've done that does basically a case study of some of these companies and draws out how they operate and the benefits of the operation, but also looks at the limitations. And it's not until you get into a synthesis that you start to see some similarity across. So for example, Gore's networking is done very informally, but it is also very, very similar to Kotter's dual system that's operating in the shadow of the organization itself. And it's also very similar in many ways with Haier's platform. So when you start to look across multiple instances, you start to get a feeling that there's something here. You're just seeing it in slightly different versions. It might be organized differently, or it might be more formalized or informal. It might be built as cross-organizational teams, or a little bit more formal as a planning or a change function. Another component is, what is the role of the project management office? What is the role of the change management office and the planning group, and how those functions can be merged then into a purpose alignment team? Because a lot of those functions, if you look at them of how to do this, it all comes together. But again, it's almost rethinking the organization. And if you're able to attend Reg's session tomorrow, he actually takes a look at how to deconstruct a traditional hierarchy and make it as three components, such that you are separating the work from the purpose alignment from the broader governance. And that's doable. And also in doing that, you're able to address some of the power issues. Because what happens in many of these cases is when you break the hierarchy up and go to a network structure, you get immediate resistance because you're attacking the middle of the organization, which is where the power resides. But at the same time, if you're able to shift that thought process of what is power, and if you think about, instead of power to control something, and you look at it as the power to influence a much greater structure, that power is actually rather empowering itself and what you can do. So it's a different way of looking at the roles of the organization when you split the control from the work itself. Okay, and part of that will be in Reg's, and again, we will probably follow up with additional webinars over the next year and additional white papers. Some of the articles we've already published on the network were some of the earlier work that we've done, that we've actually used the network to test our ideas. Based upon the feedback we get from others, we're refining where we are not explaining ourselves well, or where people are seeing little gaps in what we're doing. So we continue to use the feedback process to improve.
Okay.
Any other questions? Go
I have
ahead.
a question.
Go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Hey, go ahead. Yes, I do.
As the field of organizational change management has evolved, what I've found when I go into the company is there's a challenge with helping the leaders and the organization unlearn what they previously thought change management was. And I particularly find that a challenge when working with IT. I think there was a lady on earlier who mentioned management of change versus change management.
Right.
Are you finding it a significant challenge helping them unlearn, especially when there are so many definitions of change management? There are so many models out there that they may have been exposed to. This makes it harder to realign the organization.
Yeah. This is a challenge, but I think it's a challenge on virtually anything that we do, in that people bring their prior experiences, their prior understanding, and they need to be not necessarily confronted, but if they're coming to you, they're already questioning something. So I think the opportunity isn't necessarily to force them to rethink, but query them as to why they think the way they do and why they think the way things are the way they are. And not necessarily give them the answer, but start to cause them to question themselves, and therefore lead them to asking more questions. And that's a little bit different role than coming in and giving them a solution. Because if you give them a solution, they may not understand it, particularly if it's contrary to their experiences. But if they develop it themselves through a questioning process, then same as people who are impacted by the change, they're more likely to embrace it because they're part of that solution. Okay. Any other follow-up question?
Thank you.
Okay. Let me go ahead and do a quick screen share. Give me a second here. And this is the slide that was asked for the, let me move a couple things out of the way. Okay, this is effectuation. There's actually, these are the top 4. If I remember correctly, effectuation theory has 6 critical components. If you send me a note, either as a reply here or anywhere as a discussion on the Change Management Network, and tag me at @Rossworth and ask this question, I will link you to some resources that are really excellent, that explains what entrepreneurship is relative from looking at it from effectuation. Some of that has a little bit from a comparison of effectuation to causation, but the material that Reg and I are working on that haven't yet got out of draft form actually does that a little bit more as a good side-by-side comparison, so you can see what the differences are and how to move one from the other and really what behavioral changes take place. But these four here are really probably the main four. And again, I think there's at least two others, maybe three others that I can send you in more detail. You have what you need right there?
Absolutely. Thanks.
Okay, let me stop this share then. Any other questions?
I have a question about that particular slide.
Oh, okay.
Where you have.
Let me put it back up. Let me go back.
Sure. The question is around the idea of experiment. You try stuff and you kill as necessary. And the question is, who decides to kill?
Okay, this is actually the benefit, because if you had distributed leadership and distributed decision making, the people who made the decision, they get to decide whether it's meeting their expectations or not. So it becomes a much quicker kill process or a much quicker modification process, because you don't have to go through a formal change process or a formal approval process to take that action. So for example, if an operating group wants to make some change in operations and they get buy-in through a consultation process with any other stakeholders involved, they can make that decision themselves, move forward on it, but they do so with an expectation of what that result will be, and they very quickly will get the feedback on whether that expectation is being fulfilled or not. If it's not going the way they thought it would, then they can very quickly decide whether they made a mistake and kill it, or if some modification is needed, and they can quickly do that. That's the whole part of what entrepreneurs do. They don't just lock something in, they quickly review it, and they're in the position to make that decision themselves, because when they made the decision originally, they made it with some expectation of an outcome.
Yeah, as long as they don't get foiled by the sunk cost fallacy, right? Once they put some effort into it, we can do something else and make it a little better and keep going.
Yeah. Again, the sunk cost is kind of an interesting question, that it really goes a little bit beyond just sunk cost into incremental analysis itself. And there's a whole lecture you could do on incremental decision making versus the current basing on when the decision was made, on what basis. The critical component here is if you go in with an expectation that any loss is affordable, and you have that expectation and you're able to define what you learned from that loss, it makes it much easier to go ahead and take the loss and move forward and say, here's what we learned, versus continuing to go forward. Because I remember clearly, probably one of the biggest boardroom blowups is a decision that was made that they kept trying to fix versus pulling the plug because they didn't want to face up to management. And it got to the point that what probably would have been maybe a couple $1,000 mistake was probably $500,000 mistake, that all of a sudden they had to face up, and because it started barreling out of control even more so at that particular point. So again, I think the key is taking responsibility for the decisions and whether they're correct or not. Good point, though.
It's funny you said $500,000. We had one. I worked for Citigroup, and we had one that cost us $400 million, and it was one of those continue to work on something that just wasn't working because nobody wanted to, admit that all the money they had spent was wasted.
Yeah.
There's also a great story from Bob Galvin that addresses this issue of who kills it. And he it was a hierarchy, but he was a pretty enlightened leader, and people who worked for him loved him. But he says, you're walking down the hall and an engineer stops you and he's got this idea. He tells you the idea. And as he's going through it, you realize that you've heard this thing 4 times before from other engineers over the years. And they've all tried to execute it, didn't work, right? So what do you say to the engineer? He says, well, you can't tell him that story and say, go back to your desk, find something else to work on.
Yeah.
And he says, what'll happen is he'll go back to his desk and he'll be determined to advance this idea. And he'll work on it and work on it and work on it, run into the same obstacle. It won't stop him. He'll keep going, spending tons of energy on it. But instead, he says, you say, that's a really interesting idea. You should pursue that. And one thing comes to mind that you have to overcome, and then give the engineer the obstacle that the other engineers ran into. And one of 2 things is going to happen. Either he's going to run into the same obstacle, and after a while, on his own, just puts the idea up on the shelf, right? Doesn't kill it. It just goes up on the shelf, and maybe he'll get inspired and solve the problem sometime in the future, or he solves the problem, right? And now you've got something great. Yeah. And he said he also told a story of where that actually happened, and they put an idea up on the shelf, and it was actually a physical product they had developed, and a visitor had come through, and somebody was giving the visitor a tour, and they went by this room that then the door hadn't to be open that had all this stuff in it. And he says, and the visitor says, what's that? He says, oh, that's a whole bunch of stuff that we've built, that we've tried, and that we ended up not being able to take to market. And he says, well, tell me about some of them. And he told him about them. And as he's telling about one of them, he realizes that this thing's been on the shelf for 5 or 6 years, and now it actually has potential. And they took it to market and made millions of dollars with it.
There's many instances of that. A quick story I had once is a general manager basically pulled me aside and laughed and said, you're pitching the same stuff you've pitched before, but with a different cover. And I says, yeah, because the symptoms keep changing because it never solved the core problem. I keep changing the cover because I'm entering the symptoms to get to the core problem. And until the organization solves that core problem, I'm going to keep coming forward with the same solution, but I have to position it differently because the symptoms keep changing. But it also occurred to me at some time is that here's a saying I came up with: you cannot kill a good idea. You may be able to postpone it, but you can't kill it, because that good idea still is out there, just waiting for its time.
Right.
Good observations, though, that we often face. Okay. Other questions?
Yeah, I just want to say, Ross, it's Gary, that what you guys are talking about is Stuart Kaufman, adjacent possible. And this is the idea, is that ideas wait around, but maybe they can't go forward because there's some component missing.
Yep.
An example I kind of use is Henry Ford's vehicle. Great vehicle, great product here, but really couldn't go anywhere until Standard Oil decided to build gas stations. And the federal government decided, I think we better build a highway. And once those 3 got together, bingo. Then, of course, transportation took over.
Yep. I am a real fan of Stuart Kaufman. I've read a lot of his material, and it really speaks to me because my undergraduate degree is in biology. And he really has an interesting take that I hadn't seen before, and has opened up a lot of my organizational thinking based upon his view of complexity science. Excellent.
Ross, I wanted to several things that you've said throughout the presentation reminded me that several years ago, someone said to me, everybody goes through 3 stages to change. The first stage is abhorrence. Why are they even thinking of doing that? This is never going to work. And then finally, the decision's made, and they're working it for a while, and you ask them what they think, and they say, this is okay. I'm okay. I'm satisfied with it. And then finally, a word you used not too long ago is embrace, the third change. They've gone through hating the idea to tolerating it to absolutely embracing it, and there's no way you're going to be able to take it away. So the idea, leadership-wise and management-wise, is to be a consultative leader where you address that abhorrence group, those that you're pretty sure are going to fight you, and you get their input, you get their opinion, and even if you don't make the decision to go with what they wanted to do, they're gonna go with it and give it a good shot.
Yeah, yeah. I agree, Roger, but in another way, I maybe disagree a little bit. What you're talking about is one of several resistance transition models. And the models are interesting because they explain the stages that people go through resistance. The problem is that they're reviewed after the fact. They're really not good for proactive. And when you get down to it, if you ignore the stages and you just do change right and you involve people up front, they won't go through those changes because they're going to be involved. So looking at resistance models, I find as being interesting, but I don't find them very, very useful because they're generally indicative of having made problems at that point.
May I share an observation about an organization that does do all of these things very well?
Please do.
Yeah, Toyota is brilliant, and one of the reasons why they're able to do nearly everything that we've been talking about this evening had a genesis at some point or a start at Toyota. But there's some challenges that they do, or they have mental models that are very different than ours. One is they don't see labor as a cost. So Toyota, for example, if you work at Ford, General Motors, Mercedes-Benz, there's about $1,800 of labor embedded in every vehicle. If you move up to a Honda, Volkswagen, you get to about 2,300. Nissan, you're getting close to 4. When you get to Porsche, they have about 6. And when you get to Toyota, they have 4 times more labor embedded in all of their vehicles than the big 3 automotive in North America. And yet they make more profits than all of those car companies combined. What their labor allows them to do, because they have 4 times more labor at the front line to direct labor, they're able to respond to emergence. They're able to respond to problems, and they don't mass produce their mistakes. Right. They change every day. 2,000 times a week, someone's going to stop the line. They're going to introduce a change to fix a problem or to improve something. Yep. Because we've had focus on, people did go into Toyota and saw, they took lean away from Toyota, but they didn't see that lean, being efficient cannot come at a price of being able to be agile enough to respond to emergence. Mm-hmm. And I think because they're doing that, and they've been doing that so successfully since post Second World War, they've had one quarter where they didn't have make a profit in that time. But it's getting around some stuff that people are going to have a very difficult time seeing that and doing what they do. It's counterintuitive to everything we teach in business school.
I agree, and you see a lot of good operations approaches in little pockets here and there. The problem is that they're oftentimes not generalizable, or they're not packaged with other little bits and pieces. And that's what we're trying to do isn't necessarily come up with something that's totally brand new, but look at some of the pieces that seem to work and can be generalized and put together into a package, or somewhat of a cohesive package that you can modify parts of it to suit the individual situation, or stage parts of it at different stages in the transition. And one of the examples that Reg will have tomorrow is how to do a transition with a merger. How to do it, because, for example, Nucor. I like a lot of what Nucor does, but it's hard for me to visualize a transition between a hierarchy and where Nucor's at. And that's one of the challenges, in that it's a great end state, but it requires a lot in between. Any other questions? Is there anything that may be in the chat box that I'm overlooking because there's numerous chats there. Some are conversational, some may be questions, and I don't want to overlook anything in the long list of chat. Anything?
Yeah, Ross,
Go ahead.
there's one comment that some of us had, Dennis and myself, for example, was looking at your purpose alignment team, your PAT.
Right.
And I think I mentioned this earlier this morning here, but Principl and Chris Fussell talk about that actually in the Team of Teams book.
Okay.
And Chris Russell wrote a subsequent book called One Mission. And they kind of go into that idea, really kind of like, we can't break apart the vertical hierarchy of the military, but we ain't going to win this war in this kind of bureaucratic structure.
Okay.
So they had to create something that was different, and they kind of moved to something that was more competency based. But the key thing for them was information flow, and they had to get information flowing very, very quickly. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting, his running of he called them operational and intelligence meetings. So these were the things I saw in your presentation. That the senior leaders or the central team, they would be running these things, but they would not be in control of the decisions. They were with the teams, the crews, the patrols. They were in control of coordinating the information flow.
Yeah.
And that included connecting in Washington, the Pentagon, whatever is required. So that's probably a good area to explore next as well, to see how it's going to work.
I'll take another look at that again, but let me give you a quick overview of what Reg will be talking about tomorrow. When you look at the organization, you can divide it into three components. One would be the network that gets the work accomplished. The top would be the governance, but is more strategic and focused on the government regulatory relationships that are needed at that level, and more importantly, the big partnerships. So the top of the organization is more outward looking, not from a customer point of view, but from all other stakeholders that need to be addressed as a corporate entity. That's the top of the organization. They push down the big issue of what the purpose is that can be evaluated. But in between is the purpose alignment team that, unlike the middle of a traditional hierarchy, they don't make the decisions. They facilitate the decision-making process by making connections and by making sure that people have the information that they need. So they're the grease that keeps the thing going, but that becomes a critical component, just as you were saying, that really pulls the organization together from a purpose and alignment, as well as connection for communication. It's a critical component. What we're doing is we're trying to set it out as a separate function that becomes focused on that, which too often times is what is put off to the side and not done at all. Okay.
Yay.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just said yay. Sorry.
Okay, very good. Okay, we're about to.
I didn't realize I was not on mute.
Well, I agree with your yay. Very good.
So is the purpose alignment team at the program level? What level are they at?
The perfect alignment, the purpose alignment team is really a separate function that pulls together a lot of what is done informally in some of these other organizations, but formalize it such that their task is to make sure that the organization is doing what it needs to be doing for the long-term second and third order control.
So maybe at the enterprise level then?
It's above that.
Above that, okay.
Because the enterprise level, if you look at Hire's organization, the enterprise level is really the micro enterprises that are all linked together, both the value chain as well as the internal staff functions. And what Hire uses above that level is what they call platforms. They're basically an informal organization of key people from all micro enterprises that serve an industry classification. So they pull it together and they do basically the sorting out of issues, the diffusion of information, the network weaving at that level. We're taking that concept and formalizing it across the entire enterprise. But if the enterprise gets too big, you could do this similarly. You get a purpose alignment team for a large section of the organization, and then linkages between the purpose alignment teams to get the broader coordination. So again, the key is dependent upon the size and scope of the organization, how big the purpose alignment team is, how it's linked together. And when you get down to really small organizations, how you are able to staff that maybe as an informal, but a formal process itself. And again, the key part here is when you do an evaluation of an autopsy of failure within organizations, oftentimes they failed to do the things they knew they should have been doing, but failed to do. And the purpose alignment team focuses on doing those things so that they are done and not put aside by the people who are doing the daily firefighting.
Okay. Yep. There's a lot of cool ideas, I think, as I think Dennis has put in the chat, there seem to be coming together. Whether they converge or not, I hope they don't converge too prematurely, because I think there's a lot of conversation we still have to have. I'll throw one more in there, and that's the idea I introduced of boundary spanning. I mean, it's an old concept, but I think it still has merit. The question comes in, what are the boundaries?
Yeah.
And are these boundaries actually very permanent? Are they fixed? Or are they permeable? And I think what we're finding in the world of nature, for example, we like to build rigid kind of like walls and walls, to hold back the sea, where most places are saying, no, let's put in a salt marsh so we can absorb the water. That's a permeable sort of boundary. And I think we need to look at that to see how can we apply that to our organizational systems as well.
I agree, because boundaries are an artificial construct.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at them, they are totally permeable. And to the extent that you do make it semi-permeable or less permeable, you're creating problems for yourself unnecessarily. And it just becomes like an artificial construct to explain something simply. But I agree totally. And the boundary spanning, other issues on networking, all comes down to the network weaving function and how to do that, not only from an analysis point of view, but to determine what changes need to be made to the network proactively before problems occur in the communication linkages.
Yeah. One thing boundaries do, because we can't, unfortunately, we don't want to eliminate boundaries, because boundaries are our containers. And when we have these containers, that provides coherence.
Yep.
So kind of like, instead of using the word alignment, which is maybe order system, we're kind of shifting to it's all about coherence. It doesn't make sense to people. And those containers, those boundaries, provide that sense of people that I am a unit, I belong there.
Right. They also put a circle around decision rights to some extent too.
That helps.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
So again, it's not about roles as much. It's about identity. And as individuals, I mean, you may be in vertical org chart for sure, but you're probably in 3 or 4 informal things here. And in each, it's only one person, but you can have 3 or 4 identities, particularly in one organization.
Yeah, there is something to say, be said about that. Okay. We are really at our closing now. Any last minute questions before we close for the evening?
I have one more.
Okay,
What do you mean in the purpose alignment team? What do you mean by the word purpose?
Purpose
What does that
means,
encompass?
good question, in that it is the ultimate objective of why the organization exists.
Like the mission, you mean?
It could be mission. We're using it maybe as a different placeholder for mission, because mission sometimes gets distorted with mission statements, vision statements, and that whole issue gets a little messy. What we're talking about is, why does the organization exist? at this point in time. And as we talked about earlier, it's really somewhat static within some time frame, but it does also evolve over time as opportunities and challenges evolve. So the key then is how to gain that coherence around the total mission at the higher level and how there's line of sight across the organization to that ultimate purpose.
So the reason I asked the question is Ricardo Semler, points out that it's perfectly fine to have a corporate mission statement, but that doesn't really matter. What really matters is how each individual employee finds meaning in the work that they perform. And what you want to make sure is that when you have people working in a particular organization, that they can find that meaning, because if they can't, they should go somewhere else. And the same is true in what Gary was talking about identity. If they can't find the identity they want, they also probably ought to go elsewhere.
Yeah, that kind of becomes contradictory at that point, though, because if they can't find their purpose there, then that implies some disconnect with the overall purpose that's accepted by others. And I agree that people need to find individual purpose, and that needs to be aligned with the organizational purpose. And that's part of what we're trying to do with the purpose alignment team, because it's not just a statement, it's how it is diffused across the organization and how individual parts understand their relationship to the totality. And that's
I'm not convinced that that's that important. I mean, I think about, a church group goes out to Kenya to build a school for orphans who don't have a school. And you get people that sign up to join that effort. And the church has a purpose for it. They want to build this schoolhouse to protect the kids from the rain, right? And they state that as their purpose. And somebody else gets involved because his interest actually isn't protecting the kids from the rain. That's all fine and good. But what really hurts the kid are all the bugs that can come in and bite them, or whatever it might be. And then you get people that come out and help that project, and somebody's there because they align with the church's purpose, right?
But the ultimate still is building the school. That's the ultimate purpose that's being put together forward, that everyone's able to find maybe their little piece. But again, an individual purpose needs to fit within the overall purpose. It cannot be contrary to the overall purpose, or then right. At that point you're creating a disconnect, and you're creating a problem in of itself. So right. we don't mandate that individuals totally adopt solely a single purpose, but they need to find a way to fit within the totality so that there is a cohesive purpose across the organization. I think there's an overlap. The key is to keep the overlap from being pulled apart.
Purpose is really important, Bill. I agree with you. And, in complexity parlance, we use the term strange attractor, because what we want to go is that we see a bunch of people get together, whether it's a church, it's a silo, it's a clique, whatever. And the question we like to ask, because we don't want to presume we know, is what gives you meaning by being here? Why are you here? And you're right, you get a whole bunch of different answers here. I'm here because I like the donuts, right? Or whatever. Right. But everybody's got a different meaning for being there. So it's very interesting to kind of see. But Ross is right. I mean, like, you don't eat all the donuts you want, but if you're still achieving the missions or the organization purpose, eat as many as you want.
Yeah, and that's what we're trying to get to, is that purpose alignment here is really the tension that keeps people from going off on their own. And that's the key part, because when you distribute decision-making without any guidance, then they're going to do their own thing, their own agenda that may be contrary to what the totality may be trying to accomplish. So again, it's a built-in tension.
So there's some interesting literature on this too, and I can't cite it right now, but I can send it afterwards if people are interested, in the nonprofit sector with volunteer management. If you've worked with volunteers, they come from many different places, and to your example, Bill, about the church, if the end result is getting done, doesn't matter why they came. But
Right.
especially in the volunteer setting, you could have people volunteering because it will advance their career. You could have people volunteering because they care for the cause. You could have people volunteering because they know someone impacted by the cause and it's personal. And I think that same holds true in the corporate setting of when we think about a mission-driven or a purpose-driven organization, it's the end goal that needs to tie people together. And as you all have been saying, there can be many reasons why people are attracted to that, but the end goal has got to be the unifying factor.
Yeah, and as an ethnographer, I'm curious. I'm really curious. What's your story? Because that could actually be harnessed and used for something else as well. So that's how we engage people, and maybe we can use the energy that they bring.
Yep. That would be an additional add-on and how that fits. I agree. I think we need to call an end to today's discussions. This has been very enlightening. I appreciate the questions because the questions not only help clarify, but they also help Reg and me understand how we explain things and how we understand things ourselves. So I thank you for your active engagement today and look forward to catching up again with you tomorrow if you're at Reg's or through future discussions on the Change Management Network. Have a good day, good night, good morning, depending on where in the world you are. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.